Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Live from NYPL. I'm Faye Rosenfeld. I am the Vice President of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us. We are here this evening to celebrate the launch of an extraordinary new book by Dasha Kiper, Travelers to Unimaginable Lands, Stories of Dementia, the Caregiver, and the Human Brain. Dasha will be in conversation with David Hyde Pierce, who, in addition to being an award-winning and beloved stage and screen actor, is a great supporter of organizations devoted both to the research of Alzheimer's and to the problems of caregivers, which is, of course, the focus of this book. We're so grateful to him for that work and for being with us tonight. So Dasha's book was just published, but it has already struck a major chord, both here and abroad. It's been BBC Book of the Week. It's received glowing reviews in The Guardian, The Telegraph, Psychology Today, and other publications. It was excerpted in The Atlantic, The Guardian, LitHub, and The Daily Beast, to name just a few. And the reason for that, as you'll soon hear, is that Travelers offers an entirely new perspective on a disease that hits very close to home, simply because it's not confined to one room of the home. Alzheimer's affects the children, the spouses, the partners, and the friends of all those afflicted with the disease. It's also a disease that crops up in most families, mine included, and so, like all of you, I am extremely grateful for the opportunity to better understand why, as caregivers, we have such a terrible, terrible time coping with it. Copies of Travelers to Unimaginable Lands will be on sale just outside the room if you're here with us in person, and Dasha will be signing copies later, so please stick around for that. If you are watching online, you can purchase a copy from the NYPL shop via the link in the chat. In both cases, all purchases benefit the New York Public Library. In addition, if you have an NYPL card, which of course I know you all do, you can also check out a copy at your favorite branch or online via our Simply E app. In just a moment, I'm going to bring our speakers on stage. They'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then they can take questions from the audience. If you're in the room and you want to ask a question, you'll see that there are note cards and pencils on your chairs. You can write your question on the note card, and one of our wonderful staff members will come around to collect it. If you're watching online, and I know we have a lot of people watching online, please type your question directly into the chat, or you can send it to us via email at publicprograms@nypl.org, and we'll get to as many questions as they can. We have many wonderful programs coming up live from NYPL, something for everyone, so I'll just tell you a little bit about what we have in the coming weeks. This coming Monday, the wonderful drag performer and artist Sasha Velour will be here to speak about their new memoir, The Big Reveal, an illustrated manifesto of drag. On May 1st, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Matthew Desmond will be here to talk about his newest book, Poverty by America. And on May 9th, civil rights advocate and former head of NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, Sherilyn Ifill, will be here to deliver the annual Robert B. Silvers Lecture in partnership with the New York Review of Books. So, as I said, something for everyone, and there's a lot more, of course, so please go to nypl.org/live to check out our offerings and to sign up. So all of these wonderful and free programs are made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, our wonderful supporters and friends. On behalf of the New York Public Library, thank you so much for that support and for being with us today. And now, please welcome Dasha Kiper and David Hyde Pierce.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you all for being here. And Dasha, we know that you're here because you are wonderful and because you've created something wonderful in this book. And I just, before we start, want to tell you how I ended up being here, which is the public library contacted me a few weeks ago and said, we have this woman who's written a new book on Alzheimer's and caregiving, and we're having a talk on April 13th, and would you come and interview her? And I said no. not because I wasn't interested. It's a subject obviously dear to my heart, but it was a busy time for me, and I didn't think that I would have time, honestly, to read the book and give it the time it deserved to be able to have a good, intelligent conversation. And that evening, I was having a talk with my sister, who's on the West Coast, and a very dear friend of hers is dealing with a family member who was suffering from dementia. And she, my sister said, "Can you recommend a book?" This person, this is, books are her thing she goes to when she's in trouble, and she really needs something. And I said, I don't know, because I've read a lot of great books on this subject, but they're all from a few years ago. And the science has changed so much. How we even talk about dementia and Alzheimer's has changed so much. I'm going to have to look through them to see if there's one that I think could really help. And the next morning, I get a text from my sister, and she says, "Never mind." She found a book, and she sent me a link to this book, Travelers to Unimaginable Lands. And she said, her friend said, "It's absolutely unbelievable. It's so helpful." And I, of course, contacted the public library and said, by no, I meant yes. And subsequent to that, my sister recommended it to another friend whose mom was dealing with dementia, and the same, they were just floored by how helpful it is. And so I read it, and I bought the book and I read it, and something I never do is, because I don't like to write in books, but I knew we were doing this, and I wanted to, make notes. So I highlighted any time I found something that I felt was particularly helpful or inspiring or surprising or just something that was beautifully written. And I basically ended up with a yellow book. So that is why I am here, because of this beautiful, amazing, wonderful, helpful tome that Dasha's come up with. And the first thing I want to start with is right at the beginning. Travelers to Unimaginable Lands is such a fantastic title. Where does that come from? How did you come up with that?
Well, it's a fantastic title because I stole it from Oliver Sacks. Oh. I've always loved that line. Before I even thought about writing a book. And part of the reason I love it is, outside of that, it has that Sacksian lyricism, is that it encapsulates beautifully how Oliver Sacks thinks about his patients. For him, they're not just mere patients. They're not just people who have brain deficits. They're not just people who have compromises. They're not just people who have abnormalities. For him, they are travelers to realms in the mind that we usually have no access to. And in talking to them, they're granting us access. They are teaching us about the human mind, and ultimately they're teaching us about the human condition. And so when I would read Oliver Sacks, I thought to myself, he doesn't have the attitude of a doctor with a patient. He is a student learning from his teachers. And when I speak to caregivers, that is exactly how I feel. I feel like these are not my clients. These are my teachers, because when they talk to me about their anger, when they talk to me about their frustration, their self-sabotaging behavior, how they oftentimes fail to adapt to these unimaginable lands, they bring up so many clinical questions about the mind that I would ordinarily never have gotten to. And I think that their stories are not just moving, but they're incredibly instructive about who we are and how we think and how we relate to human beings.
Well, I think one of the power of this book is how loudly it speaks.
So loudly.
No, is that you don't, so many wonderful books like this are proscriptive, and they say, well, do this or don't do this or whatever, and you don't go there. You, in a very Oliver Sacksian way, speak with great compassion and understanding and learning, and also a kind of humble attitude about what you've done. You mentioned the man who mistook his wife for a hat as an influence, and I just think of just that story. If you know it, it's your own insight into how to tell these stories is very much, and I mean this as a compliment, in the spirit of Dr. Sachs. So,
Oh, that's so kind.
yeah.
We should end here.
Okay. Now, speaking of Sachs, I want to talk about the first line because the first sentence of the preface is, as far as I'm concerned, up there with "Call me Ishmael." This is the now imagine you've gone to a store and you've bought a book about Alzheimer's and dementia, and this is the first sentence. When I was 25 years old, I moved in with a man who was 98. You feel like, was I in the romance section? What? But I mention that not just because it's such a great line, but also it shows your gift, for, your humor, and also your gift for surprising us, and not telling things the way we've heard them a million times. And so I feel like that preface, there's a story in that preface, which is the first story of a family dealing with dementia, which also, if I'm right, is your first experience as a caregiver.
Correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that was?
Yeah. I mean, me moving into the Bronx at 25 was as much a surprise to me as anybody. I was, at the time, very much on the path to getting a PhD in clinical psychology. And I think I mentioned to a friend in passing that I just find it emotionally unfulfilling, intellectually unfulfilling, and ultimately I was just feeling like I was not being of use. And that's the reason I wanted to get into this field to begin with. And he offhand said, well, there's a gentleman who has memory loss, and his son is looking for somebody to stay with him. And I thought, this would be an opportunity to actually work with a human being instead of being in the research lab. And when I heard that he was a Holocaust survivor, I already immediately projected so much onto him because there was a lot of, my maternal grandfather had 15 years in the Gulag, so I immediately had this protective instinct over him. And then I thought to myself, well, maybe this is my Saxian moment that I was certainly not getting in academia, where maybe this is a way of having a front row seat, learning from somebody, learning about the mind as it struggles to preserve itself.
Mm-hmm. And so you had, like you said, you had an image of him, but you had no experience of this particular landscape, this situation.
Not at all.
So how did it hit you? And how did you deal, and what did you learn, in 3 sentences?
I think I would say that what I learned is that my expectations were entirely wrong. I expected to feel very protective of Mr. Kessler. And because he was the person who had the disease, he had the person who had the vulnerability. But what I found as I spent time with his son and him is I began to feel just as protective of his son. Because in many ways they began to mirror each other. And this happens a lot in families. This is not just the son, but his father would lose control over his emotions. His father would repeat the same thing over and over again. He would become rigid. He would never listen. And then father and son would kind of go back and forth in that same argument, same back and forth of, why don't you do this? I did it yesterday. No, you didn't. So it was this very predictable pattern of behavior. And and then I would hear people tell, then I would tell people, I would overhear people give Sam advice. And I began to feel very protective of Sam when they gave him advice.
Sam is the son?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, stop arguing with your father, stop doing this. And I thought, first of all, much easier said than done. And secondly, I just suspected that something was going on that he wasn't able to control. And the reason I felt this way is because after these arguments, when he would really be angry with his father, what happened invariably, just as anger happened, shame happened. It really killed him, the guilt, about when he would lose his patience with his father, because he wanted the best for him. He understood his father had a disease. And so I thought something is going on here. And I wanted to protect him, because one of the things I thought, what can I do to tell him, to convince him about his father's disease, to break that cycle, so that when he would look back at his caregiving experience, he wouldn't have to carry the shame. And I took it upon myself. I felt like I'm not just failing Mr. Kessler, I'm actually failing the son as well, because I am not sufficiently educating him. And then a curious thing happened. I started educating him, and there was very little difference. and 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 of course his feeling is like, well, I'm a jerk. This I don't learn. But I thought, no, something else is happening. There's something about this dynamic between you two, and later on, as I started working with caregivers, there's something about our own mind that struggles, just as the person who has dementia struggles. And I began to be incredibly fascinated by that dynamic. What's happening here? That well-intentioned, loving family members could get caught, and they know they don't want to. Every day they promise, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm not going to do it. It's useless. And every day they go right back in it. Yeah.
I think that it's such a great insight, and also that word you used, mirroring. That's something I found really surprising as someone who's been in this situation and been working in this field for a while, that it literally is, you have a person with dementia and they're doing the same thing every day, and they don't realize they've done it or don't seem to realize they've done it. But then you have a caregiver who's also doing the same thing every day, and even though they know, this is not productive, this is not going to help, I'm not going to get angry, I understand this person is sick, and yet you could describe their behavior in exactly the same way. And I just think there's something healing about that. I was talking, there's this sort of terminology questions about like caregiver versus care partner. And I don't know where or if you have any thoughts about that distinction. But what I was going to say is just that in that description, in this mirroring thing, that I then understand the idea of a care partner, because when one person has dementia, obviously someone else has a little bit more of the upper hand. But this idea that they are partnered in this dilemma,
correct,
which you've elucidated, and so that leads me to you've sort of talked about this, but I don't know if there's more to say about it. About what do we get wrong about dementia disorders?
Yeah. There are a lot of misconceptions about dementia disorders, particularly caregiving, and I think a lot of those misconceptions are rooted in our misconceptions about the mind. We tend to think that as human beings, our minds are pretty rational. And so we understand that the person who has dementia, they're off the hook. Their mind is no longer as rational. They have impairments when it comes to judgment, all of that. But the caregiver's mind, we still expect them to be rational. And so that's why they're given very often very rational, sensible advice. Don't yell at your mom. It's her brain, it's not your mom. Don't get angry. They don't know what they're doing. Don't blame them. It's not their fault. They're not doing it on purpose. Communicate, don't question their reality. Step into it. All of these things, pretty sensible stuff. And what I find is when I would get desperate calls from caregivers who are at their wits' end, what I was hearing are not sad caregivers who are grieving. What I was hearing was angry caregivers, full of shame, telling me, I know how I'm supposed to behave. And I thought I was a sensitive person. I thought I was a sensitive wife. And here I am picking on somebody when they're down. I'm throwing my husband's dementia in his face. I am I'm telling him to do things that I know he can't do, and then I get angry at him. Everything I learned from all the seminars don't seem to stick. And I always tell them, clinically and as a person, my job is to validate them and to tell them, you're not alone. Because I hear it. I always say, I've never met a saint in dementia caregiving. And I hear it, and what I really wanted to do in this book is I wanted to give it a neurological framework. Well, why is it so human? Why is it that everybody is having that same response? Why is it that we could conceptually know something so well, but when we're with a loved one or with a family member, and they could provoke us in just the right way, all bets are off, all of our knowledge goes out the window, and that's just your mom, and that's just your husband, who knows how to push your buttons.
This brings up something which was slightly shocking to me in your book, based on my own experience.
Yeah.
You have a quote that says, symptoms may reflect problems that have always plagued a relationship. And I remember being in this business that people would frequently come up to me and say, you know, my mom is completely different now. She's swearing like a sailor, and she was always the nicest person. Is this the real her coming out? And I knew the answer, which was no, it's not. Sort of like you're talking about just explaining what the rules are. This is a brain that's short-circuiting, and every brain is different, and every pathway is different for whatever the dementia is. And so there's nothing that says, you know, that this reflects any part of this person's personality. But what you're saying is, but I guess that there actually are familial patterns, relationship patterns, that not only get acted out, but in some ways get heightened.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, because this disease is as varied as the human condition, I can never say anything for sure. But one of the things that I think the other misconception we have about this disease is that we give caregivers way too much credit about how reasonable they can be, and we give dementia patients not enough credit for the much capacity they have. And a lot of the capacity they have is the cognitive reserve, which is a lot of their unconscious networks still work. A person's personality, their talents, whether it's your musical ability, whether it's finance, whether it's being a lawyer, a therapist, a lot of their skills and talents are unconscious processes, and those stick around for a very long time. And I always joke that a parent's unconscious skill could be, you know, pressing those buttons when it comes to children. And I would say that when it's a gift.
Yeah.
And I would say the same thing, and I would say the same thing for spouses. Like a spouse is, you've been with somebody for 40 years. I would say that's that's over 10,000 hours of learning, exactly, you know, where it hurts. And so that's unconscious knowledge. That's not necessarily going to go away. It's not like you get your dementia diagnosis and all of a sudden they're like, okay, I'm going to stop being the person I am. And so those dynamics really last because it's something that they have, and it doesn't require those deliberate thinking that usually dementia takes away. They take that higher thinking, but the unconscious processes stick around early, middle, and this is the reason a lot of the times people are able to work even into their middle stages of dementia, because so much of the sophisticated abilities that we have, we usually attribute to higher processes consciousness. They're not, they're just deep within us.
Now, okay, that's so revelatory to me. So can you just explain that a little more? The idea of the difference between what we all think of as our rational, in-control mind and the fact that actually unconscious processes are at work.
Yeah.
What do you call it? Zombie something?
The zombie systems.
The zombie systems.
It's what philosophers call the unconscious. And they're doing their thing. Is that we tend to overestimate how much all of us are in charge. And there have been a lot of studies about that. We all feel very much in charge, but we tend to overestimate how much we are in charge. And the things that are in charge are really these long patterns of behavior. So I would say that it would take if you were, well, I'm gonna use a person who's not in this room. So let's say in the book I use a therapist, and this therapist has second stage dementia, and his friend, and it was also her mentor, really wants him to give up the practice because she thinks it's not ethical anymore to continue practicing. But it's very confusing when she talks to him because she still goes to him for supervision because he's that good. So how do you ethically say, hey, you've got to quit your practice when he's still sophisticated enough, helpful enough, could still call her out It's a very tricky thing. So all this higher reason is actually buried deep in his unconscious from years of developing his craft.
Wow. There's a couple that you talk about in your book, and I think it's such an extraordinary story that I wondered if you could just tell it to these guys, which is Mitch and Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just sort of let them know what they're going through.
Okay. So Mitch and Elizabeth actually had a really loving, wonderful relationship. Eventually, Mitch got Alzheimer's, and his Alzheimer's took on a curious form where there would be certain times where he thinks that his wife is an imposter. So they'd be in the living room together, and at a certain point, he would look at her and say, "Now you've got to go." And she, at first, in the very beginning, "Go where? I don't understand." "Well, you got to go home." "No, this is my home." And she would argue with him. And the arguments went on. And of course, he would get so outraged, he would really kick her out into the hall to be by herself. And when she would tell me this, she would tell me this feeling so guilty. And I thought, "Elizabeth, why in the world why are you feeling guilty?" And she said, "Because I didn't have to argue for so long. I made our lives so hard because I argued for so long." And I said, "Why do you think you argued for so long?" And then she smiled at me and she shook her head, "Because he had an answer for everything." And the thing is that the reason he had an answer for everything, and this goes back to the fact that dementia patients are not as helpless as we think, is all of us have a thing that Dr. Michael Gazzaniga calls the left brain interpreter. So it is a certain system that when things don't make sense in the world, our left brain interpreter comes in, kind of sweeps the inconsistencies away, and makes a story that makes sense. So what happened was, the reason that dementia patients are so good at arguing, right? And it's the fact that they're really good at arguing that baits caregivers. If they were passive, it would be cool. But it's like, all right, that's fine, nothing to do here. But because he kept picking fights. So when Elizabeth would say, "Look, this is a picture of us, the two of us, you must have planted it there." The fact that he was so dexterous and nimble and actually quite intellectually capable of constantly giving answers meant in some ways Elizabeth understood that he was sick, but at the same time, she was sparring with somebody who was pretty nimble. He was able to give her one excuse after another, and she was really trying to make sense of it. And the reason he was so good about it is that his left brain interpreter was coming in, trying to make sense of all these anomalies and discrepancies that she was throwing at him. And the other thing that made her, and this is, I think, the more heartbreaking thing that I told her, when she was really down on herself for arguing, and she said, "I just can't believe I did that to him." And one of the things that she was doing was she was constantly dealing with a very sweet Mitch sometimes and a very aggressive Mitch at other times. So she was going back and forth from a very difficult husband, and then back to a very loving husband she's known her entire life. So of course it's an emotional whiplash, and she told me that she felt like an abused woman because she never knew which Mitch she was going to get. But the reason she kept arguing is not because she was bad, but ultimately it's because she loved him. She told me the love doesn't go away, and that's a double-edged sword, because the love doesn't go away, so that's the reason that despite how he acted, she was still with him. She was still there for him all the time. But because the love didn't go away and she still felt connected to him, then it's like, help me out here. You're still in there. You're not allowed to go away. Why are you acting like this? Come back. Rescue me. And this is what psychologists call a phenomenon called the real self. All of us, when we interact with families, we don't just see brains or brains at work. We think that something bigger is going on, and that is a essential self, a real self. And what she was doing is she was constantly arguing because she was trying to get through to her husband's real self. And why wouldn't she?
Can you just also tell about their dates? You know what I'm talking about?
I do.
This is already a complicated and sad story, but part of it was.
Part of it was, so they had a ritual because Elizabeth knew that it would keep Mitch calm. After work, she would meet Mitch at a bar at a restaurant. And he would always be there, his beer at hand. He was chummy with the waiters. He was a schmoozer. Everybody loved him. And then she would greet him and hug. And there was always this feeling that people would watch with them. He was a flirt. He knew how to charm. He charmed everybody around. And then they would start laughing. And if people were to look at that couple, they would think, that's an enviable couple. That's a good couple. Nobody suspected that she dreaded these get-togethers, because she knew what was going to happen right after the drink, where he would look at her blankly like a whole other person and say, now you go to your place and I'm going to go to mine. And so...
And she would run home.
Yeah.
Change out of her heels and into sneakers to get home in time to be there for him when he arrived, and then face what she was facing. It's just extraordinary.
And in a complete world of surrealness, he would come in, hi, honey, how are you? No memory of what happened. No memory of her kicking her out.
There's a phrase in the book, dementia blindness.
Yes.
What is that?
It's something I called a phenomenon I observed. So I would get calls a lot from caregivers. And of course, it was always full of shame and guilt. And part of it is, I can't believe it took me such a long time to see this disease. And they look back at it and they're like, the symptoms were clear, you know, and a lot of the symptoms are very clear. And so one woman told me that when my husband retired, he started calling my office 15, 20 times a day. And it'd go on for months. And she said, I can't believe I didn't realize that this was a symptom. It was not something he's ever done before. And she couldn't understand it. And then she said, oh, you know what? It must have been denial. And then she blamed herself for the denial because she's like, I just didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to deal with my husband. And the truth is that she was thinking of divorcing her husband. So she really doesn't want to deal with it. And the truth is that, you know, psychological denial is perfectly healthy, and it makes more than enough sense that she would be in denial about this. But I think that something neurological is going on. For when we talk about denial, we usually talk about the psychological parts of denial, but there are neurological forces at play as well. Our brain has a certain tick when it comes to looking at the world. It doesn't like a couple of things. It doesn't like ambiguity. It doesn't like inconsistency. It doesn't like unpredictability, which is, by the way, something dementia will always throw at you. And what it really doesn't like are anomalies. So what does it do? Does it throw in the towel? No. Our brain gets to work to get rid of all these things. So instead of accepting that an anomaly happened, i.e. my husband has dementia, what we do is we create stories to make sense of it. Our mind is very good at taking nonsense and creating sense, taking something that is unfamiliar and making it familiar. And so when I listened to her talk, I began to understand how she created those stories. It turns out that her husband was a big shot lawyer, and this is the first time he was retired. He never took her career seriously. And he was a man who needed constant attention. He got a lot of attention. And now she figured, now that he's alone at home, what is he going to do? He's going to call me a bunch of times. And so that was the story. And the other thing is that she felt he never thought that my career was important. He always put himself first. And so she began to see those phone calls not as a neurological glitch of somebody who is calling and calling, but somebody who is putting himself first, because she kept on saying, honey, this may cost me my job. You've got to stop doing it. And then he did something else characteristic. He started guilting her. Because anytime he didn't get what he wanted, and he needed a lot of attention, he would throw it back on her. Oh, I understand, because you have a job. Yeah, there's no space for me anymore. I understand where I am. And so she was not, and at that point, she was not dealing with a brain in distress. She was dealing with the same husband who did not know how to back off, who did not know how to respect her, and who did not know how to listen to her needs.
There's an aspect of that, too, that you talk about, which is part of, I think, the caregiver holding on and which causes so much pain and distress, is not wanting to lose the person that they love.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that, which sometimes happens later, at later stages of the disease, is that they no longer have that interaction. If they are successful at being able to not be upset, it's because in some way they've given up on what you were talking about, the essential self, this person. So when I talk about a catch-22 or a no-win situation.
Absolutely.
Also, I have to say, part of the thing that I find so healing or something about the book, when you talk about, well, we have this left brain, and what it does is when things are crazy and they don't make any sense, it puts together a story and ignores all the crap and just find, and I feel like I look around the world today and I look around the country today, and we all, no matter what side of what we're on, we all seem to have this ability to look at, some of us look at something and say, well, that's a shit show, excuse me. And others say, no, because, and their left brain has...
That's exactly right. And what neurologists would say it is that your left brain interpreter can be hijacked. So most of us have healthy left brain interpreters. We need things to make sense, otherwise our world would be chaos. But what happens is your left brain interpreter could be hijacked by bad information, whether that's a neurological disease coming in from here or propaganda.
Yeah.
So lots of the times, I'm sure both sides are looking at the other saying, what are you thinking? How could you possibly believe this stuff? Look at all the evidence. But the thing is that all of us have very healthy left brain interpreters making sense of our worldview, discounting theirs.
Yeah.
So don't try to change people's minds. We leave on that pessimistic note.
Okay, so now I want to ask you this. Actually, first I have something to say, which is I have been speaking to friends of yours who are friends of mine, mutual colleagues in this endeavor. And the words they use when they describe Dasha, humble, sterling with people. They hold you in the highest regard. They feel privileged to work with you. And above all, they talk about, and anyone who meets you or reads your book can feel your generosity and your kindness and your empathy. And one of those very people said, ask her, where does her empathy come from? It's an easy question.
Oh, God, that's so kind. Feelings are very mutual. Gosh, I wish I had something smart to say.
Well, they didn't say smart, so...
That's true.
Let me expand the question a little bit, which is maybe not just where does empathy come from, but all of these traits, how do you maintain them in the thick of this very challenging and frustrating work? How do you find balance?
Yeah. In terms of being in this field.
I think so, but also in life, because you're never not in this field, as you know. You take it home.
That's very true.
So
that's very true. This might be a terribly cheesy answer, so forgive me, but when I work with caregivers, I know that oftentimes compassion fatigue is a big part of it, and it could lead to burnout. But I think that the saving grace is that, not only do they truly move me with their stories and their pain and their anger, and I really admire the people who are actually able to lay that anger on the table. And what I see is that they actually make other lives better by validating each other. So they're doing so much of the work, and I get to witness it, and the work is also just intellectually extremely gratifying. The education I was hoping to get from grad school, I got from my clients. I listen to them, and it really, all the time, it brings me back to certain clinical questions, and so they bring things into my mind that I ordinarily would not have. In the same way that Oliver Sacks's patients bring questions and minds about the human condition that he would not have seen. So really, I feel like they're granting me access.
And you're granting access to us, which is incredible. Before we go into questions, I just want to read something. We started with that first fantastic line of moving in with a 98-year-old from the preface, and this is the last paragraph of the preface that I just wanted you guys to hear. These days, as I walk home in the evenings after seeing caregivers, I think about what they've told me. I try to imagine their lives, the problems they face, and the adjustments they have to make day by day and hour by hour. And I call to mind Dr. Sachs' description of patients who are, quote, travelers to unimaginable lands, lands of which otherwise we should have no idea or conception. And I want to chime in, let's not forget about the caregivers who must travel with them, because once you hear the stories that caregivers have to tell, once you learn about their sorrows and struggles and their resolve to endure, you too may see them, or yourself, in the same sympathetic light that Dr. Sachs shines on his wards as archetypal figures of classic fable, heroes, victims, martyrs, warriors. That was awesome.
Hearing you read that.
She was nervous, and she had no reason to be nervous. She was absolutely fantastic. Okay, sorry. So question, can you discuss the difference between a spouse caregiver and an adult child caregiver?
That was the reaction I was hoping for. You know, anytime I try to understand this disease and I'm dealing with a caregiver, to me, ultimately, I have to begin with a relationship prior. And so, of course, the relationships between a child and a parent are going to be different than the struggles between a spouse. And that's going to inform how I think about them. So I don't know in terms of the question of, is there the difference?
Yeah, a specific difference, I guess, between, you know, a trait that is more about a spouse's relationship with someone with dementia versus a child caregiver, adult child caregiver.
Yeah, you know, I think that, again, I think it really has to do with if it's a, you know, what was your marriage like? What was your parental relationship like? And the rest kind of follows. I think that, you know, obviously there are different grief there's a different kind of grief for marriages. You know, I hear a lot of, this is not what I expected my retirement to be. This is not what I expected my grandkids to see. I didn't want the grandfather to be deprived of something that he's wanted his entire life. So you're bearing witness to different kinds of grief. So that would be the spouse. For a lot of adult children, a lot of the times they might have not gotten, I think most adult children really want to make, no matter how fraught it is, they really want to make their parents proud. And some of the hardest things is when they feel like they've never gotten to get there. And a lot of the difficulty is, you know, how do I get my parent to respect me, to listen to me, because now I'm the person who's in control. And that is a very delicate power dynamic, because, you know, you could be 90, but your child is your baby. So you have to proceed with caution about telling them what to do, and you want to be very careful about protecting their self-image.
Right. When did you know this would be the focus of your career and life?
Really, I think I fell in love with it in the Bronx when I the first case study, Sam, I think that he was really my first teacher. And hearing him getting stuck in loops, and then hearing me trying to explain the brain to him over and over again. And I thought to myself, the problem isn't him, it's me. I have to approach this differently. Something is going on. I have to explore what's happening in the mind and what's happening in the relationship. And I think more than anything, it made me really respect people's frustrations. We're really told to accommodate the patient's anger, but I think that you have to really respect the caregiver's anger as well. It has a lot to teach us, it has a lot to tell us, and there's something very truthful about it. So I think that you have to be, I think in order to, and I just really loved how Alzheimer's touches on every family wound, every difficulty of human existence. It just rips everything open and it heightens it, and it's, I mean, what's not to be moved and fascinated about?
Okay. You know, you spoke with such admiration about caregivers, but there are a lot of people who, having had that experience, would be done. And the fact that you went once more into the breach, dear friend, is pretty great. What are your thoughts on caregiver respites, such as medical model adult day centers like Elder House in Norwalk, Connecticut, or Riverside in Greenwich?
Well, I can't speak to those specific sites,
Okay.
but I think that, you know, if I could give any advice to caregivers, my human response is, please get out of the house. My more clinically measured response is self-care. So I would say, if you find any moment where you could put your family where, you know, in a different environment and you could be alone, or you could be with friends and you could get time away, that is always a very good idea. I think that that's one of the key markers to preserving your sanity.
I think that's true in marriage.
Yes.
I mean,
But you just hit it. This is the reason that dementia is so fascinating. What is true in marriage true in life just happens to be high stakes a million times more true.
how should a caregiver respond when it feels impossible to have any conversation?
I wish this caregiver was here because I'd like to know more. When is the question impossible to have a conversation with the person anymore?
I don't know.
What do you think?
Well, let's see. So when it feels impossible to have any conversation, that's interesting. It could be someone who is no longer conversant. But it could also be conversation has lost its meaning. I mean, there are a lot of different.
I would first say that's just always a heartbreaking conversation, a heartbreaking situation. And as a lot of caregivers say, it feels incredibly boring. And then they feel guilty because they're bored. Because they visit, there's nothing to talk about, but they're visiting. And they're like, how long do I stay? What's enough? Because conversation allows us to measure time, like, oh, we had a good time, now it's time to go. But when there's no conversation, no connection, it feels so empty. To which I would say communication could mean different things. So I would say discover things that could give communication without words. It could be music, it could be touch. It could be anything that, and this person knows, I'm not the expert, this person who wrote it is the expert, so they know their family member. Think about something that would make them feel loved, and that itself is communication. And I would say also give yourself the grace not to do it for 3 hours. Give a little bit of what they think is nourishing and refueling, and then leave.
Great advice. And also the question reminds me of an actor friend of mine whose mom had dementia, and for the last months of her life, 3 months, 6 months, did not speak a word. And he and his sister were at her bedside. And at one point, his sister just took their mom by the hand and said, "Oh, Mom, we just love you too much." And out of complete silence for months, the mom said, "Oh, you can never love someone too much." And they were the last words she ever spoke, and she was gone, you know, not in that moment. But so there's also that. It's like we, sometimes after, depending on your religious beliefs, after someone passes away, there's a question of, are they gone? They're dead here, but are they here? How long?
Yeah.
All that stuff. So
Yeah.
it's what you can put up with yourself, what you can contain, I guess.
And what I love about that communication is that it's short and sweet, because oftentimes caregivers, they put too much of a cognitive load and they want too much. So sweet, simple sentences
Yeah.
are oftentimes the way to go.
Great. Here's the last question.
Sure.
When does giving in to the question or argument become a, quote, free pass, and having the relationship lie fallow because there is cognitive impairment?
Oh, I'm struggling a little bit to understand that.
When does giving into the question or argument, I guess giving into, so you let them win. I think this is
Like
right.
the person who has dementia, you're
Yes,
letting
I
them
think
win?
so.
All
I think
right.
so. Oh, I see. I think the distinction is, you say, fine, yes, you're right, great.
Yeah.
And when is that a good thing? It's a free pass and it makes everyone happier. And when is it sort of the relationship has lost something because you've given up? Is that, I don't know if that's, whoever asked the question, if that's close.
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard. It's so hard to know when. I think the tricky thing about this disease is that giving up, it changes from minute to minute. You know, there's nothing static about this disease, and that's part of the reason it's so aggravating and maddening and confusing, is that, you know, you might decide to give up 1 minute, and then the person who has dementia might surprise you and you're back in it together again.
Yeah.
So I would say, I don't know, but I would probably tell that caregiver to say, I would look at it differently than giving up. I would say, try to find a way to try to find an emotional keyhole to be able to communicate that they will understand. Because there are certain things that they can bond over and understand. So,
It's tough.
yeah, it's tough.
All right. Well, that is the end of our questions, unless someone else has one. And I think we're there. Thank you all for being here. And Dasha, thank you so much for this incredible gift.
Thank you so much for doing this.